Hi, everybody. This is the Composition Symposium, and we're happy to have Bob Morris as the guest. We're going to have an interview today conducted by I-Hsiang and Nick, and I welcome everyone and turn over the screen to you. Good luck.
Thank you for some time.
Thanks.
Yes.
Well, Person Maurice, first we have to thank you so much for introducing to tell your very pristine and just wonderfully crafted recent pieces, and one of them provoked kind of a common thread of questions, and one of which inevitably arises is they're wondering about the relationship between those paintings that showed up in the video and the music that generates as a result, which is landscape reading. So I'm just wondering if you may elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, it's very it's certainly understandable that people thought I had something to do with selecting the paintings or even of seeing them, but it didn't happen that way. I was asked to write some music for an opening of a show that would deal with American landscape paintings. I said I would. I wasn't sure, in fact, probably wouldn't have come out for the premiere. So I wouldn't have ever seen the paintings that were on exhibit. However, they interested me, but I never got a chance to look at them. Nevertheless, when the video person and Ray Hutada decided to make the video, they thought putting them in would be a good idea. And I thought so too. And their selection is what made the connections of the music, not mine. However, I have no disagreement with what they did. And perhaps they would have done a better job than I would have done under the conditions. But this brings up an interesting question, you know, whether or not it's intended or not. What is the relationship between paintings, which are works of art, as opposed to photography, which isn't necessarily art, but could be, and you know, making music that's art music, and the connections are very complicated. Sometimes we get some cues from the artists themselves, like Ron Duran thought of some of his music as some of his paintings as connected with jazz, and certainly Paul Klee is another example who actually wrote pieces, did pieces that were, in fact, in one case, even a transcription of the notation of the E-flat minor fugue from the first book of the Royal Library of Clavier. So there are people who make a one-to-one correspondence between this thing and that thing, and then there is a much more complicated set of resonances that come out of art that may be shared. And I could go on connecting these ideas. But just generally for me, landscape painting has been very important for my development as a composer. These are paintings I actually chose and actually wrote pieces connected with them. Clear Sounds Above Hills and Waters is a piano piece I wrote in the late 90s. The late 1980s. And that piece, I even had performed with that scroll that this came from, rolled out in front of the audience at the same time. That took about 13 minutes for the piece to go, so the scroll was nice and slow, so you could see all the little details in it. But Chinese painting, and also Japanese painting, is extremely expressive to me because what leaves out the space in it, the sky, which is often just white. But you read into it the shapes because of the things around it. And there's a really interesting interplay between figure and ground in these paintings. What is the figure and what is the ground? And that is so important to me as a composer, so that, you know, normally in music, in traditional music, we have a theme, a melody, and there's an accompaniment. So the ground and figure are quite clear. And it's very hard to reverse them unless you're playing the accompaniment, you know?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going on and on. So
yeah, so you raised the kind of the inherent spaciousness and landscape you like, and I think that kind of solves the existential question of music being necessarily generated from nothing and fading from nothing, that kind of impermanent ephemeral art form. I think there's a connection between there, is it right?
Oh, I think that music is especially ephemeral, and it's often connected with magic, because music, where does it come from? You know, like you make a sound, it comes out of your body, but you don't even see where it comes from. And instruments are interesting because you actually see on the instrument and measure the monochords, and then the instruments derived from that. You could actually see what the intervals were and measure and things like that. But the voice, no. And all the possibilities of voice can make, all the different kinds of sounds can, not only the ones in the language, but ones that might say transcend language, what are called phatic, P-H-A-T-I-C sounds. So it seems to me that music is essentially the memorization of things that are fading away. It's like very much like Proust, actually. So if you don't have any memory, you don't have any music.
That's true. So
whereas with a painting, you can always have, you know, you can always have it hanging in your room.
so one of the things that kind of a space and spaceness and paintings are more directly perceived and dissected, whereas in music, I mean, one person raises the question or a kind of a request to for you to elaborate on that the idea that music touches the substructures of consciousness, which you which you converted to Rehotola. So that I'm not sure if that's true as of you, but I think that necessarily presupposes that we somehow share kind of a common universal, let's say, mental topology in our thinking, and from that topology, we necessarily think about music syntactically, but on the other hand, because we have that kind of an inner topology that kind of transcribes or is very much mutually accessible to the paintings, which are a kind of a geographical topology in a way.
Okay. I don't think I believe the ontology stating, because I think that ontology, or what you think is what you think is real, what you think the world is quite different in different cultures. For instance, the question of the perspective. That's something that was discovered and worked out in, you know, the 14th century in Western painting, and became an important backbone to make paintings. But before that, and in a good deal of non-Western art, perspective is not important at all. In fact, I remember going into a museum in India, in Bombay, and the guy there was describing this painting, and it was all these different scenes all interacting with each other, you know, and monsters over here and people and princesses and, you know, horses being drawn and fighting and stuff. And, you know, it looked like a huge panoply, like it made no sense whatsoever, except that if you knew the story this is about, you would know exactly where to go in the painting to see, oh, this is the beginning and that's the end, way up here and over. So the topology was based on, you know, a story that kind of decoded the painting. But if you didn't know the story, and if you weren't also invested in believing in that story, then this art made no sense, and the topology would therefore be random. Or on the other hand, perhaps a person who knows that kind of topology would look at a Western painting and say, why don't they can't they keep everything in line? I can look at things and it seems like that, you know. I think music's the same way. Now, I do believe there are some universals. Well, here's going to be universal that we usually don't talk about. It's so trivial. Everybody has two arms usually. Even nose, you know. And then we can go a little deeper. We all have eyeballs. And we also have the possibility of seeing things, and there's intersubjective agreement about what seeing is. And we test that out by, you know, talking about things, and we come to conclusions about what it is that's true. But of course, it happens in a cultural environment. But still, across cultures, because we have access now to different cultures, we can test those things out. So for me, the universal that's really important is the idea of substructures of the consciousness. And I think that that happens in a lot of different cultures in different ways. And I'm not thinking so much about a metaphysical concept as much as, you know, just what perception is, what paying attention is. And that those things are very, very deep. They're not simple, and they're very, very deep. And on top of these, they're kind of the soil in which the plants that represent the different cultures can grow. And in music, the soil that I was kind of mentioned in my talk with Ray, that soil is the things in which emotions grow. And these emotions are of a certain kind in Western music, and they're also different kinds in other cultures. Some cultures have emotions we don't recognize as such, or they're complicated emotions where they're simple in the other cultures. And what happens here is that in this soil, different emotions can grow and they can twine in different ways. And what a composer is doing, or an artist just generally is doing, is playing with the soil and inventing new plants.
That's a very kind of a Paul Klee kind of a thought.
Yeah, right.
Kind of related to that, there were a lot of questions about the relationship between conscious decisions in your music and maybe intuition. And I'm actually really interested. I'm sure you'll have really good things to say about this, but this question was, one of the questions was, how do you, the question was, how do you make the balance between the really logical mathematical design of a selected pitch and the beautiful color of the sound that comes out of the mathematics, and I guess which one comes first was kind of what this question was asking.
That's a chicken and an egg question, because it's hard for me to figure out. A lot of times when an idea comes to me, it can be any kind of idea that will be used in a piece. Ideas that come to me sometimes are indeed color. Oh, I know that I've got to write a certain way, or a certain kind of counterpoint. Like I almost started a Stonkertit a little while ago because I thought it was a great counterpoint, but then I got dissuaded by other things in my life, so that's on ice. But I have lots of things on ice like that. Then in another piece, it might be the way in which instruments correspond to each other, or in conversation, or the kind of conversations where people don't pay attention. These kinds of, any of these ideas might come into a piece. And sometimes the ideas are technical. For instance, gee, can I get all the different trichords in a 12-note sequence? I worried about that for a long time, and I had to write some program to find out, and I did, and there were 2 of them. So that's what ended up for the bell cannons. Okay. But so sometimes it's a technical question, sometimes it's a very musical question. Usually the idea of a phrase or a melody is not something that comes to me immediately. That comes later. That develops out of this more basic research or thinking. And a lot of times I just put things in ice. I don't give much thought to them, but because I'm a composer and I've composed a lot, they go into a special category or bin where I don't forget them. I forget almost everything else. Lucky I came here today. I might have forgotten this. But the main point is that these ideas, I can categorize them as being mathematical or musical or intuitive. They're just ideas. I'm just lucky I get ideas. That's all I can say.
Is it kind of a linguistic problem, as Nolo said, about trying to invent a kind of a either phraseology or syntax that is exclusively your own, that also kind of proportionately applies to your musical instincts a bit?
Well, some of the ideas I've had are indeed ideas about syntax, but there was just as many that are about semantics. For instance, the concept of a bell piece, which would be not a concert piece, but it would be a piece that would be used for making something serious. That's what the bell piece is really about. So you play the bell piece, and all of a sudden, the place becomes transformed into something that has a ritualistic or a numinal quality. So, like you see those videos the guy made, there's just a kind of ordinary park and he's sitting there and, you're saying, that's nice. And then when you plays the piece, all of a sudden you feel differently about it. So that's a different kind of semantics than ones that occur in concert music. And certainly other kinds of semantics are involved in my outdoor pieces. And there's not only one. In some of the outdoor pieces, it's very ritualistic and, deals with concepts of repetition and worship almost, or benediction. And in other pieces, it's very secular in a way. All these people are at the same time doing stuff together, like the piece that was done at Syracuse many years ago. The whole question of semantics and inventing semantics and inventing syntax. Well, yeah, I mean, I started out with the syntax of the 12-tone system is one of the influences, but also many other syntaxes I know about. For instance, those of Indian music, Bhairavat music, the classical musics, and certainly Japanese music and jazz. And then all the different syntaxes we lump under the term tonality. I mean, the tonality in Prokofiev is a tonality, but it's not the same one you find in Bartek, which is also tonal in some other ways. And then compare that, let's say, with Stravinsky's tonality. All of these are different syntaxes that can be described if you want to take the time to have certain rules of progression. The way Stravinsky does it is one way, Bartok does it another way, and those become syntactic choices. I mean, for the composers involved, it probably is just language, you know? I mean, Beethoven is a syntax, it's called tonality, and of course he was playing with that tonality like a poet does with language. But Beethoven is writing a piece. He's not thinking about, you know, is this, you know, the 5 going to 1, any more than when I'm saying a sentence do I say this is a verb and this is a noun. However, I can describe my sentences as verbs and nouns if I want to, and invent new languages and new ideas because I have this concept of structure. Beethoven could have done the same thing, and maybe he did in some ways because there are hints of very interesting set-class relations in late Beethoven. I could go on and on about this question. I think we even talked about it in lessons. So, what I'm saying is essentially that the invention of syntax is a part of the compositional thing. And in fact, it's exactly that has become so important in 20th century music. So everybody invents a language. Now remember the composer Niccolo Castiglione, who could hardly speak a word of English, but he said something to me that was very interesting. He was at a seminar in Michigan, and somebody was trying to translate, and of course he was very poetic, so the translation was not going very well. And all of a sudden he said, "No, music is not invention of language." No, I think what he meant is the invention of language, of course, is something you need to think about and maybe implement when you're making music, but it's the use of that language that makes the music. And similarly with the mathematics, you know, okay, I know all this mathematics, it helps me think about music, etc. But it's when you use it that it becomes music. And that's what separates the men from the boys, or the adults from the children, or something like that. Sorry to be sexist, folks. But that's what separates the accomplished person, the gifted, from the talented, or the you know, person who's not very good at it. That they know how to make something out, make music out of stuff. And that's maybe you might call, maybe that's where intuition is. I'm not sure, because a lot of it is something you can learn to a certain degree, but to invent it is where the real joy is.
So sort of related to that, or yeah, actually directly related to that, is that someone was saying in a question that they think your use in the commensal canon departs from traditional serialism because your music is instead a vantage point for thoughts about pitch presence or pitch being. So is that just, I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing the question, but is that just being a, like, that's just...
It's a great question. Except I would disagree with the premise of it. I don't think that there is a point of serialism that is independent of the composer. For instance, Webern has one way of doing serialism. Beethoven, yeah, him too somewhat. But Schoenberg is another way. Berg is a third. And these they have the principles, of course, the row and, you know, aggregate completion and order. That's about it. That's all the whole system is when you think about it. So it's hardly a system. It's just a set of tools. It becomes a system when these composers write it. So yes, my music does deviate from Schoenberg. It does deviate from Webern, etc. Because I know these composers and I admire them very much. But what I did in my theoretical work was to implement the idea of taking the idea of a set class and a ordered set, partially ordered set. You know, different kinds of order constraints, things like that, like as things you could decide to put into a way you thought about music and make music from it. So the idea of my book, Composition with Pitch Classes, is simply to set up the possibility of tools so that you could make music in any way you wanted, as opposed to, you know, deviate from or be in the influence of a particular composer. There's an idea to independent of tradition in some ways, but at the same time accommodate tradition because you'd be looking at it from the point of view of your theory.
Yes, well, but there's a kind of a direct question that arises, which is then, I mean, in serialism, I think that there's a kind of a traditional ascription of character of Sufism to Jewish the Jewish belief. One of which is the idea that the home has a kind of a very essential, a kind of an imminent relation to its parts, and vice versa. And I don't think you necessarily did that in the Bell Canons. So I'm just wondering, if you deviate from that traditional notion of organicism, then how do you ensure that the end result of your competition works?
Well, as I said, I'm planting plants, and so if that's the case, they're organic. But I mean, that's an analogy, obviously. I mean, a lot of composers, a lot of theorists took Goethe's idea of the Urpflanz, which was this. He had this wrong idea about evolution, but nevertheless, it was something he said. He thought that there was a general plant that came, and then it got diversified into all the different kinds of plants there was, as opposed to the idea where you have things built from the bottom up and growing, eventually transforming, and plants grow out of something simpler. It's not from a general idea. But nevertheless, this idea of agnosticism, which is the idea that everything relates as a whole, like the body relates to the whole. I mean, organicism, you know, like we have mouths and we have feet and we have things like that, but they're always functional. They have something to do with maintaining the whole. And in fact, each cell is like a little entity in itself. So there's a kind of microscopic, macroscopic relationship. And if you're asking all those things, sure, I try to get that in some pieces and then others not. I mean, you know, I don't even think I make a conscious decision about that. In the bell canons and in this particular, the landscape greetings, there is a way I went about making the music based on canons. So that was an important aspect. And also canons that gave you the maximal diversity of sounds. And that makes it interesting to compose, because your problem now isn't making something that is spinning out of something and getting more diverse. It's just the opposite. Here's something that has a lot of diversity in it. How do you make unity out of it? That's a much more interesting question to me than the other way around. You know, taking something, a theme, and then you generalize it. And, you know, like, so for me, for instance, maybe development sections are more interesting than fugues. I don't know about that because I really like fugues. Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe I got off the point here. Somewhere.
Not at all. So in a sense, you're kind of. I mean, the idea of pure orthodoxy or authenticity of culture maybe isn't valid, or just a kind of a conceit at all.
Well, I think it's generated by the person. It's not generated from outside. It comes from me out. So if I find that something is authentic or organic or traditional, it's because I see it that way. And maybe a lot of people will agree, because remember, all this stuff is not just subjective versus objective. It's intersubjective. That's why we can have critics. If we didn't have intersubjectivity, then the critics wouldn't be there. They'd be just another full voice in the wilderness, and it would be a wilderness.
Mm-hmm. But how about the idea that you mentioned, that the subjective time, that kind of a very, I'm not sure that kind of an intersubjective, let's say, experience of the kind of temporality, which allows you to.
I'm saying the potential for intersubjectivity doesn't necessarily mean there will be that. Because it may be impossible for one person's background to make the relevant moves to get the intersubjective view from another. And it may be on the basis of culture, or it may be in prejudice. In fact, that's the problem we're having in the United States right now, that people can't understand things from the other point of view. You know, and that their epistemology is based so that it makes it impossible. What I mean by that is epistemology about fake news and all that stuff. Each side of the coin here thinks the other person's news is fake, you know. And so when you have that kind of a situation, intersubjectivity is very, very difficult. You see, so. I'm just saying the potential for intersubjectivity is certainly there, but it doesn't isn't necessarily the case that it is going to happen. And so that's always a disappointment, perhaps. Especially it's a disappointment if you're trying to reach other people and get them to understand things. And to some degree, as a contemporary composer, you know, we're in a tradition that is not very well understood by the general public. It's hard to say exactly what things mean to people who are in the world right now and have come up in the Western traditions that are here. It's really can't figure that out. But the whole point, and of course, being an older person, I don't understand what young people are doing. I mean, you guys are 2 generations below me, or I'm 2 generations into your distant pasts, So the point is, there's already a connection issue that is very interesting to me, but, and I work with it. But, I can't really deal with this question aside from accept it, because if I worry too much about it, then one thing is I may start to alter what I'm doing to make things happen, and that might be a dismissal of the things that are important to me. That would mean a problem in my integrity as a composer. Or on the other hand, I could be just a very iconoclastic piece, like a person like Ruggles, and just say, I'm gonna sit in a cabin and write music. I don't care what anybody thinks. I don't want to be that either. So I'm steering between kind of nihilism on one hand and, essentialism on the other. And I want to be in the middle to veer one way or another as obstacles come down my path. But I don't want to go off the road into either of these two sides. So that's my position with respect to this question you're actually arising. And of course, the more you know about different cultures and different ways of doing things, the more possibilities of the swerve you can have.
Yeah.
So you can become a better driver as you know the other terrains.
So from this viewpoint, how do you manage the extent of musical direction or that kind of a notational?
Do you mean teleology?
Not really. Is just a question by Professor Liptak that he's wondering how precise or if there's an underlying philosophy or principle behind your managing the extent of directions, expressions, that kind of things you.
Well, it's one thing to have sort of, this is my statement, but that always comes after you're finished. Then you figure out what you got. In the process of writing and also the process of performing, it's exploration. So in a way, you're trying to keep things open. Our composition is really a speculative situation. You're trying to find out things that could possibly be. Use the term possibly a lot. What could possibly be, and then discover these things and finding yourself in places you never thought of before. And then that leads to a body of music. And that body of music might have some coherence because after all, it came from one person, but that isn't the place where you're operating from. When you're writing a new piece, everything you composed before is not relevant to it, and in a direct way. It's certainly relevant in terms of the things and crafts you and experiences you had before, and also it's relevant with respect to how self-conscious you are, because you're going to think about your past music. Is that any good? Is that bad? Etc. All those things. It's all irrelevant, really. The main thing is when you're writing is to explore the things, situations you're in. So I can't really answer that question, except that I do have pieces that are finished, and they went into a certain direction. But when I was talking about, for instance, the bell canon and the landscape reading is having the same kind of structure, that was about how the structure is there. Now, what do I do with it? And it was done very differently in both cases. But it turned out that the structure of canon seems to be something formal to me. And that formality has a good side because it represents the kind of formalities you would have in versus kinds of rituals, like in the Confucian rituals, which are extremely formal situations. That was considered by Confucius to be the best way people could interact, is through rituals. So, that's one way to think. But I was just saying, now, if I use this canon idea again in another piece, it might be in a completely different service. Now, I have written other pieces based on the canon system from which these pieces come, which are not like this. I mean, I have a guitar piece called Après Vous, which is a very romantic almost and a variation kind of form piece. And there are a few other pieces. It was in the early 2000s. I was working with these canon systems, and I went on to something else.
Yeah.
Now and then I return to them. My quartet called Quattro per Quattro, there are some canons of this kind. I haven't thought of using them recently. I have a whole bunch of arsenal. I have a big room full of tools, and now and then go in there and say, maybe I can do something with this one or that one, or maybe I'll think of some new tools, which often happens. Yeah.
Well, this kind of departs from the locus of our discussion, but how about in terms of how do you ensure that you are conveying a musical idea to your performers?
Hmm. That's a very good question, because that's the crux of the communication issue. It's not so much getting with the audience. The audience is the basis, the whole business of communications handled by the performers. They have a text, or they have something they interpret and they bring to the audience, just like when you read in public, okay? But the writer, the composer, doesn't have to deal with the audience. In fact, the composer can't even figure out what the audience is, because after all, you know, I write a piece and play Munich. Well, I never met anybody in Munich. I don't know what they're going to say, you know. It's a different culture, you know. Or maybe it's played on the radio, and I don't know who's listening. So the point is, I can't really bring into the compositional question all the possible audiences it could possibly be. But of course, you know, writing music for the concert hall does solve some of those problems. Main point is that as I'm thinking about performers, it's very important to be clear, even when you're trying to write something that has ambiguity and choices. Performers want to have clarity. They want to know what it is they have to do. And they will also accept the fact that they have a lot of freedom, but you have to tell them it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I've had many performances of pieces that were open way back in the 60s, where for a group of people I knew would just play the pieces great. I went to Tanglewood and had one of my pieces played, and the group there could not get it, because they weren't used to the idea of like it says, choose a low note. Which note? Come on, tell me which note. I said, well, it depends on what you're listening to. See, in other words, so these ideas just weren't available to those people. But to give them credit, after a few rehearsals where things were not going that well, all of a sudden something clicked and the performance went pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
you know? That kind of situation is where you're giving the performance a lot of license, and they have to actually have that license. Yes, I've improvised for 10 years, and it says so on my page here. Mm-hmm. So it's something like that. I mean, so, but if you give people another kind of license, which says I am a musician, I can read music and I know how to interpret it, you know, maybe that's a degree from Eastman School. That license says that, you know, if I give the performers something to play, providing it fulfills a lot of notational meanings and conventions, and also performance practices that are not written down, then it will be successful. I mean, in terms of getting to the performance, getting beyond them, that's another question. The real problem we're having here is that the functions of the performer in contemporary music has been very various, and now performers are ready for this. But when I was a kid, this is all really new stuff, and so present a piece of music that, you know, had a lot of glissandos for the strings in it. The string players are up in the arms. They're saying, how dare you write something like this for this? This is horrible. We won't play it. I mean, this actually happened to me in an orchestral rehearsal. And, you know, I didn't feel like I was in a situation where I had many friends. They did play the piece, though. You know, they were professional enough not to kill me and play it. But on the other hand, they didn't like it. And now that's no longer the case. So we don't have problems like that much anymore.
So in some cases, there requires some kind of a prerequisite understanding of your musical intentions. But a lot of times it is more kind of a given, granted thing.
Right. Well, you know, you play it in a piece of mind. You know, you get the music and you listen to it and you figure out how it goes, and you know what's required. The conductor's there also to help out, and you also can tell, since you're a composer, maybe more than some of the other players, how this piece works out and works. But even if you're not a composer, you know, you can tell the pieces of a certain kind. And a certain way it goes. I mean, it might be something you never thought of before, but at the same time, it makes sense from the point of view of your training. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's one of the things we learn in a school like this, is to interact with performers and learn how it is for them. And it also gets back to another important point, is that a composition is really not completed until it's performed, because then you get the meat of the result. You know, you hear the sound performed in an environment by people. And when that comes back to you, you find out what was successful and what wasn't. Sometimes the lack of success was not your musical notation, but something that they didn't understand or something that you didn't explain, you know? So that can happen. But anyway, a lot of times you change notes. A lot of times you change, you know, dynamics, lengths of measures, things like that, because you find out that in the performance there was a need for more breath there, or much more of an accent or something like that. And you hadn't thought of that. You thought it was in the score, but it wasn't. Those kinds of things. So those are really quite important, and that feedback from the performer to the composer is important. Now, of course, this is very different in electronic music, where you are the performer. You know, you're putting the music on tape or on a computer file, and you're making all the sounds yourself. There, it's a very different matter. You are therefore the person who makes the music, but it's not performer any longer, really, because this is all pre-planned. You're not performing the piece every time you go into the electronic, go into the performance area. Your piece is played, and it picks the media piece. You don't even have to be there for it to happen, right? Now, there's an interesting kind of music which involves electronics, but also involves performers, and that's live electronic music, which a lot of people are doing now. I've done some myself. And there you're actually performing. You are using electronic sounds in real time, and you are, again, the sounds themselves are not detached from agency.
So I think we're going to come back to talking about like the virtual aspect of this piece, because I think there's a lot to talk about there. But just quickly, there were some questions about outdoor performance, and yeah. So the question, one of the questions said, many composers are experimenting with space and location where performance takes place. As these boundaries are pushed further and further, music has changed in many different ways. The notations, performance methods, the format of creating, perceiving music has all changed. And the question says, I wonder what outdoor performance means to you and how your music has changed or developed due to that transformation.
Okay, well, I actually brought a text with me. I'm going to read you a little of it to give you an idea of what my aesthetics are with regard to this, okay? So this is from a text I recently wrote that accompanies a piano piece. The piano piece is about 90 minutes long so far. It's not completed, but it's around enough so I can put out a score. So I'll read you two paragraphs from this text called About From Here On Out. From Here On Out is the name of the piece, so it's about from here on out. My music is highly influenced by how I attend to natural surroundings. By this, I mean a sense of the suchness of certain trees, streams, rocks, valleys, and the like. Sometimes an entire landscape has this noumenal quality, such as locations in the Southwest United States. Suchness is a term I encountered in Buddhist philosophy. Before I knew the term, I was unable to even name what I felt about these special places. They seemed to possess an inherent energy, even though everything was still. In fact, stillness itself manifested this energy. I later began to understand that the energy was there because every place is actually a process. That is, a place is what it is because it is presencing. Anybody can experience this by visiting a river and watching it flow by. The river is there, but it's also in motion. And generalizing, what might once have been called passive of an inert is essentially active and alive. This meant that the basic unit, at least in my perception, was not of things, but of acts and processes, which is why for me, attention itself is an active process. Another consequence of this idea is that both perception and the world are always changing, even if they appear stable. If you don't feel the energy of presencing when overt changes are slow and glacial, you might think things are permanent, but more on this later. As I matured as a composer, I began to understand that the suchness is to what I aspire in my music. Of course, many composers think of musical form as process, and I feel process in the way the music I admire manifests itself as an unrolling sound scroll in the way in which it presents itself in time, no matter what kind of music it is. This realization occurred most forcibly in 1990 on my first trip to Arizona. I was struck by how the desert landscape and its wide open sky, odd rock formations, wild plants, and strange changes of terrain mirrored my internal states of mind. I realized that the experience of identity was something I'd already been composing and wanted to continue to purify and strengthen. From then on, the connections to music and nature and vice versa became a palpable part of my compositional outlook. This led me to compose music meant to be played outside and not just concert music played outside. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's built right into everything I do. Mm-hmm. It's not like a different category. And my main problem has been, since I got into that place, how can I bring the ideas of listening to music as a form of nature, it is a nature, in music that's played in the concert hall? Mm. And so in one case, I have a CD that it came out here. Now I'm showing you work here. Okay, can you see this? Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of subsumed into the virtual background. Sorry, but
Yeah, it's okay. We'll have to stop to that. Oh, it's all right. We don't need to. It's
Right.
called Rippling, Electroacoustic Music by Robert Morse. It's on the Renovo label. And there are two pieces on it. One's called Mountain Streams, which is based totally on the sounds of water, mainly stream sounds. And Mysterious Landscape, which is a computer piece that I play in real time. It usually has video with it. These two pieces are examples of the purest aspect of the outdoor music I do. I mean, it's really meant to be outside. And although Mysterious Landscape is played inside, and so is the other one, but they have the elements of natural unfoldings, etc. The sounds are natural. I mean, because I'm using in both pieces sounds that are from natural sounds. I mean, you know. Now, the concept of nature can be really different in different cultures and from different political points of view. So I'm not going to say that my ideas are at all necessarily commensurate with other people's ideas about nature and how that fits in. But I just say that my ideas have been very influenced by, of course, my own experiences out there, but also the beauty of, again, those Japanese and Chinese and other landscape paintings, and also a lot of contemporary painting, which doesn't have a subject. It's abstract the way music is. It has color, it has sound, it has all the great things painting has, but it doesn't have something it's about. It's about itself in a sense, in the same way that a fugue's about itself. The painters, long time for painters to come to this, whereas we had it right from the get-go.
Would it be correct to understand your intention as by presenting outdoor music, you not demarcate the lines between the exterior and the interior, but you further blur and I mean blur the
Interpenetrate even, yeah. Yeah, that's right, exactly right. Yeah, so I'm not, I mean, think of me as, I think of myself as a musical person. My world is music comes into it. I tend to pay some attention, let's say, to some piece I'm hearing on the radio, or I purposely put on a raga I like, or I'm walking down the street and all of a sudden some musical idea occurs to me, or I'm thinking about a bad performance I had 30 years ago, or maybe 5 minutes ago. And all those things are happening all the time in my life. It's not like being a composer is outside of reality, and it's like something I do in a woodshed or someplace. It's just me. It's happening to me, and I'm relating to it. So music is not something that is totally separated out. So the whole question of, you know, is my music about something? It is this thing. It's the way, it's me. It's my ontology. It's the way I think. A lot of people don't share that because they don't have the musical, you know, experiences I've had or the interest in them. But I know, for instance, artists are thinking about this all the time in their own lives. So they look at a building and say, "Oh, that's an interesting angle. I got to think about that one," or "Look at that color there, that's really great." My daughter is an artist, and she got into commercial colors because they were considered to be without value from the artist's point of view. You know, the kinds of things you find you know, a swatch of painting that says Kelly green on it or a voluminous red. And she says those colors are really interesting. And she made a lot of paintings using these colors, which are commercial colors, but she took out of took them out of the commerce and made them into art. And so this is something, you know, that happens in the world to her, see? And that's what I think that people don't understand about creative people, just generally, or maybe we all understand it if we can see this in ourselves, that whatever we perceive and do is part of our lives. It isn't like our lives are here and then we see, you know, it's not like we have some sort of person that's outside of ourselves, the super ego, let's call it, looking back on us and telling us how to interpret what we're doing. We're already interpreting it. So that's why the question of you know, intention or the question of meaning and all these things doesn't seem to resonate right, because it's already solved. It's already happening to one. Okay, this shows like that was a real showstopper. So let's go on to something else.
Sorry, we're just trying to figure out the next thing here. So yeah, we wanted to ask about spirituality. Sorry, I don't know where the questions are.
Well, I think the original no question is just how spirituality affect how you perceive nature. I mean, as distinct from, distinct or related to music is up to your choice.
Okay. Well, I was brought up as Episcopalian. I took the religion fairly seriously. And I got out of it because I saw all the hypocrisy happening in it. And I began to notice that just generally, that in all the religions I know, including Buddhism, there's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of failure of imagination. I mean, if religions are there because it gives us a worldview that makes us compassionate to other people, well, I'm all aboard that. But unfortunately, religion doesn't always do that. But the main point about it, spirituality is kind of this term that has evolved in the 20th century, and it means having a certain kind of respect for the numinous, that is, the things that seem to be from another world, that seem to have a quality of going beyond themselves. This is what I call suchness. Okay, so this suchness idea could be a religious concept. After all, the concept comes out of Buddhism, but Buddhism itself is not necessarily a religion the way a lot of other ones. For instance, in early Buddhism, there's no God. It's just Buddha. Buddha is a man who reached enlightenment, and he's there to tell you how to do it yourself. You know, that's a very different concept than normally we have in religions, where there's some God out there. You know, might be something that's a concept more than it is a entity, but it could be a person, and that God is something we pray to, that is the origin, etc. Blah blah blah. All those things that go along. Those are not considered by me to be what we call spiritual in music or in art generally. And I'm going to take it within the arts. So some composers are known for their spiritual nature. I mean, some of them actually make claims to it, like John Tavener, the English composer. And then there are others that, like Gia Kanchali is a good example of this kind of orientation. And there's even a trend in Europe called the New Spirituality that deals with Alvaro Part is another example. People that are dealing with what I consider to be a meditation on simple sounds, and because they have their voice. They're already singing, let me put it that way. So you don't have to do much. All you have to do is be open and sensitive and pay attention, and music will happen. And
we are already kind of access mundi in a way.
Yeah, right. Okay. So what I'm saying is that that kind of spirituality, that interests me a lot, frankly, and some of my pieces involve themselves in it. I think Landscape Greetings is some of that in it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that, you know, I consider to be a way of life that will guide me. It's more of a place I can be that is nourishing.
Mm-hmm. Well, would you just quickly, maybe a tangential question, but touch on how the other movements of bell cannons were constructed?
Okay.
Are there any?
There's only one bell cannon, and that's the first one, the one in October. And the reason why I chose October as to be number one is because that's my birthday, is in October. So it was an egocentric reason. But I thought, why not? I think I wrote it in October too. So I wrote this first canon, which is based on this all interval row, and it just automatically gives, because the intervals along the row like this, when you pile it up in a canon, they become vertical. And so all the different trichords that are in the row are going to verticalize as they go by. And so that's interesting enough. But then I had transformations that I know about from my canon theory that will transform every one of those canons into another canon under a different transposition. And since there are 12 transpositions, okay, 12 months. Okay, and so each canon be for a different month. So each canon has the same kind of format. It starts out with three voices coming into agreement, finally, like this, and they kind of one hit the augmented chord, and they go on like that. And all of them have all the trichords in them, too. And but they're all different sounds because the canons are different. The canons are always pitch canons. They're not just pitch class canons. They actually have the same contours, each of the lines. However, they get mixed up with each other because the canons overlap, like in Renaissance polyphony, where you have a voice crossing a line. So that happens there. But the main idea was to provide something that was very formal, kind of quality ritual to it, that would, again, transform a situation that it was played in into something that had a certain degree of respect, a certain degree of presence. That was the idea behind it, and these canons were a good way to do it. The idea came to me just because I was writing for bells, and I said, bells, you know, like, it's going to be it, nothing else. Won't that tire out the listener? You know, I'm thinking about stuff like that. And then I thought, you know, bells, that's, you know, church bells. We think about, you know, bells that are used in services. And I'm saying, yeah, bells have a quality just by themselves as being serious. And after all, what is the bell? The bell is just like a light that you hit it, and it takes a while to decay, just like a light. Or like a thought even, like, boom, you hit it and your thought decays. Okay? And then maybe it occurs again when you all of a sudden come back in that, or maybe it's like your consciousness, where, you know, you're paying attention to something and then your mind drifts away from it. And then all of a sudden it's, oh, back to consciousness, and I'm now to the next thing. And so each one of those is like a hit of a bell. And all of those concepts kind of came to mind, not, I'm, you know, of course, extrapolating from what I actually thought of at the moment. I think I just sat down and said, I'm going to write a bell canon. That's basically what happened. But the reasons for it, I can reconstruct and also figure out why. So this is the solution to my problem: how will I write a piece for bells, to write this kind of a piece. Now, had I been asked to write a very different kind of piece and I was going to use the canons, maybe they would be used in a very different way for different purposes, as in that string quartet I mentioned, which the canons therefore are going to replicate harmonically all the little tetrachords. And so that was a way in which I could get the harmonic ideas of tetrachords, which are very important in that piece, to happen. And of course, that piece relates, of course, to Elliott Carter's music, where all little tetrachords are almost the fabric of the stuff. So, but it was a way of using these tetrachords in a different way, in a new way, and also putting them in canons. No one knows how to do this unless they read my paper. I'm serious. And I thought about it for years. How can I make canons where I can be really sure of what the actual, you know, harmonic events are? You try and do it without that, you know, even in writing a traditional canon, where you have, you know, a lot of possibilities because each of the consonantal sounds can be articulated a different way. But even then, it's hard to write a canon. We all know this. And the fun part is, can you do it, you know, and can you do it at different levels, like Bach and the Goldberg variations, which is so amazing. And so, you know, I admire Bach for exactly this, thing. He has this mind that's able to make music out of these very formal relationships, and he enjoys it. You can tell he's having fun with it. That's why the last part of the Goldberg variations brings in those folk songs about, you know, eating food. And it's very humorous, but it's a way of saying that I've had a lot of fun here doing this. And that's the way I feel about it too. It's not something that's supposedly serious and, you know, supposed to mark my music as being highly intellectual or, you know, venerable or, you know, worthy of contemplation, etc. At the best of the contrapuntal composers of the 20th century, all that crap. You know, I'm not interested in any of that. I'm just interested in playing with stuff. And so that's what happens in the canon pieces. But sometimes that playing with is for a very serious purpose.
Well, the other question is, do you have other works that are only supposed to be performed during certain time periods?
I have not. That was the one that really kind of came together, because my experience as a meditator has been extensive for many years, and I wanted to give voice to the experiences of attention in meditation, and so that's the reason that piece came out the way it did. But I think of some of these recent electronic pieces I've been doing have some of that quality. For instance, the one that I mentioned, Mountain Streams, is based on the stream sounds. It starts out with a little koan, and it's a man talking to a female teacher, and the man says, "How can I enter the way?" And the teacher says, "Do you hear the sound of the mountain streams?" And the fellow says, "Yeah." And the teacher says, "Enter there." And that's the beginning of my piece. So it does have a meaning in terms of, you know, the streams unfolding something. What is that unfolding thing? Well, the way the Buddhists talk about it is the Dharma, or the law, the way the world works, which is impermanent. It's continually going on, but it's continually changing all the time, in little ways and big ways. And so that piece is an attempt to deal with the impermanence or you can say the transformation or the process, any of those words fine, of sounds that evolve over time. And if you spend time by a creek or, listening to sounds or watching clouds go by or anything, you can watch crowds assemble and disperse. That's the way that Xenakis put it. Any of those concepts, any of those kinds of long-range processes that are happening, that gives you a certain kind of insight into the way the world actually unfolds, and that's what they mean by the Dharma. So, the student is coming to the teacher saying, "Hey, teach me, tell me what to do here. What's my first assignment? What text should I read? You got any wisdom up your sleeve? That kind of thing." And instead, the teacher says, "Hey, well, listen to the stream for a while."
So changing gears, so one thing we haven't talked about is the virtual performance. And
Yeah.
so actually this piece was written before that all
Just
happened.
happened to be a good example of it.
So, that really,
I didn't think of it as that. In fact, it sound really very different in the hall, that hall. But by the way, on the video, I have a picture of the hall when I'm talking about the piece. I don't know if you noticed that.
yeah.
I didn't mention that. I probably should have. But the hall in which it was going to be played, it was on the video. So in that case, the hall is very resonant, and the piece is going to be very, like a loud echo on it. And I thought it would be very beautiful that way. It turned out the piece is great this other way, too. So it was a revelation to me. It's like what happens to your music when it gets played by other people, it gets to other places. Like I just saw fantastically the Balanchine version of Apollo Mozagake by Stravinsky, 1928 ballet, which is considered the first neoclassic ballet. And it's so incredible, the way in which the ballet connects the music in both ways. But it was not something that Stravinsky worked out ahead of time. He just had this piece. He says, "Here it is, ballet, go for it," and then they make this wonderful response, And of course, this relationship with Balanchine to Agon is another beautiful place. But Balanchine worked with commercial composers. He worked with, not commercial, but I mean, people doing music and popular music. He did a lot of popular dances and things like that, as well as this more refined, let's say, dancing that occurs in Agon, for sure. Right.
Well, in your piece, well, you mentioned in the interview that the subjective experience of time in pieces like Landscape Greeting allows for greater intimacy.
Yeah.
So I guess this question is asking a good question, which is, in what ways does a virtual performance affect the sense of intimacy and timing, and what challenges or benefits did it bring?
Yeah, that's a great question, because now you'd have to deal with this question of simulation, which is the AI question. Like I was talking to somebody in AI, and they were talking about this and that, and I said, "Well, why are you concerned with all this stuff, about reality and all this?" AI is about simulating things. It's not necessarily giving you the real thing. I mean, when you talk to Siri on your iPhone, that's totally simulated person. There's no such person. It's just an algorithm that you're responding to, right? But it has features that make you think it sounds like a real person. If you question it a little bit, use the Turing test on it, you're going to find out it's going to fail miserably. Going to know it's not real. But up to a certain point, so the same thing goes for a virtual performance. A virtual performance is one in which you read in to the performance what you would normally read into an ordinary performance of people are relating to each other. But this is nothing new, because what has been going on in commercial music for 1,000 years, well, since commercials started to be use music creatively, let's say 1945. What people do is you get a phone call, you're a freelancer, can you come out on Thursday and do the full part for this 4-second commercial? Yeah, sure, I'll come in. You do it, and there's 7 other instruments that'll come in at different times and queue up with the tape, and they make it, and that's how the piece is done. It's the same thing, except that, it's not done over the internet. But there are programs now that can actually, are now fast enough so you can play with another person. And now it's virtual performance in the sense that you are performing and you are relating to the other player just as you would in reality. But this is a much better, relationship. The one that we're talking about here is where everybody plays on their click track and you put it all together later. Well, if you think of the piece ahead of time as being a virtual performance, which I did not do, you might do certain things in the piece, It's just, it's lucky my piece is amenable to this kind of performance. I imagine if I'd written one of my pieces where everything's, done in time and you have to play the rhythms in such a way, well, it never would have been possible. Mm-hmm. Whereas this piece, because it had this openness with respect to time, and you've had to play not very many things, and a lot of sustained notes that made the piece susceptible. And if people were thinking now about doing the visual performances with Brad Lubman and all that, they might think about using a notation that's open in this way, because that allows a lot more creativity for each player, rather than to say, oh, it's just going to play my notes at the right time. If you say, well, play this in 20 seconds, and you don't hear anybody else, but you have room to play something in a musical way. So I suggest it's not a bad way to deal with it. Now, the question of musical time and intimacy is another thing that we're talking about. And that is when you sense time, you're relating to it in a way that you're tending to it. And then it becomes something very, very, giving a lot of presence to you. Just think about, well, you do meditation, that begins to happen. You're really attentive to the idea of time, the present. And it broadens the present out from being just a little slit to a whole place, a whole day. I mean, we can talk about the present in a lot of different ways. We can talk about it as, today I'm giving my interview, okay? So that's been an hour, but it's kind of a unit. I'm also today gonna, working a little more on my piece I'm working on, and so that's a bigger span of time. But that's time will be from the first time I thought of the piece about 3 weeks ago, and to when I finish it, which I think will take about 3 more months. So that's a unit. We're living in the 20th century, right? Or the 21st century, actually. So I'm still stuck in the old century. But we live in this new time, or we live, in the millennium. So we have all different spans of time, you can say, of the nows. But what we're talking about intimacy is when these nows open up in such a way that they aren't conceptual, but actually perceived. And that perception draws your attention and yourself, and you become one with the time, and that's where the intimacy is. When there's anybody else in the room that's doing that too, you feel very connected to them. That's why meditation in groups is interesting, because you get the energy, everybody's energy comes into it.
So just really fast, do you think that composing for virtual performance is something that composers will get used to doing in the future, or even that they should?
I think many of them are already doing it. As I said before, when you have, let's say, think about this, Babbitt writes a piece for tape and performance, okay, performer. Well, the performer has to learn what's on the tape, which is composed totally independent of the notation. It's reading. So that's already virtual performance, if you think about it that way, because the other part is just there. You're not relating to it. You're just trying to do what you got to do at the time. And then the relationship is based on what the engineer does. That's what's going to happen with Paul Coleman. He's going to put the thing together so it makes sense, and that'll involve a lot of mixing and tryouts, and maybe he'll adjust some of the temporal relationships to make more sense. A lot of everything can be done, and then you can get a good product. I think my piece wouldn't be that interesting, by the way, if it hadn't been done as a video with all those different blocks in which people come in and out, and you notice things happening, which corresponded to the time relations in the piece. But also the landscape paintings put in certain places. Sometimes I made really good choices, like the two Indians that are looking off to the left. When that happens with a B flat and B flat against it, it's just terrific, It's like, yeah, this is something they really got it, like those two guys. Or another place where, there's this little Buddhist thing that's going on. There's like a Buddhist scene. And I'm looking at that and say, that's really cool. Like you're looking to this music and the things all of a sudden dissolves into some scene. And it's, halfway across the globe. Like we're, and then all of a sudden you say, oh, well, that's really cool. The music's like allowing that to happen, and then it disappears. So those things are really great. It was nothing I thought of, but it just worked really great. So the credit goes to, again, the arrangers, the person who thought about the video. Just like Paul Coleman's going to have more of a role than just being a person that who does the puts it all together. And that's something he does very well. He's done that a lot with other pieces. He did some editing on a piece of mine that was put out a little while ago. And he's really good at, figuring out how to balance things and cut the music just in the right places. And yeah. So what I'm saying, that's another place where the artistic sensibility comes in, is this job of putting together the parts of the visual performance into the whole. Yeah.
Well, I think one final question will be, I mean, one person mentions that there is a presence of that kind of an extremely lush kind of a microtonality and of course the rhythmic complexities and
Mhm.
the ethymo and all other kinds of music in the world. And I think that person is wondering if you ever thought of approximating that in your kind of a pitch-centric idiom. I mean, the
Okay,
ephemerality
let
of
me show you something else that I think will show up a little better on the screen. Let me see. Let's see.
maybe
Why don't you
slow
hold it
down.
over? Pull it down here.
Oh, there we go. You can see
Yeah.
it better.
As long as
This is
you're-
a book I wrote about 10 years ago called The Whistling Blackbird. If you want to know about these things, all the things that you've been asking today, it's in here. Okay, so I'm not, you can find the book in the library, of course, you don't have to buy it. But nevertheless, if you do buy it, come by, I'll sign it for you. But in addition to that, in that book, you will find a lot of the ideas I'm talking about today in a much more concise and unified connection. And that's exactly why I wrote it, because I wanted to bring all these ideas into one book. So I would suggest that, that's a good way to deal with the question of Bob Morris. Of course, it's fun to respond. I liked today very much. It was fun. But on the other hand, in terms of getting the scoop down the way I wanted to say it, that's why I wrote a book. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Great. Thanks so much for today, First Morris.
Okay, bye. Have a nice day.
You as well.
Bye. Okay.